All right, good afternoon, everyone. If you find your seats, we'll get started.
The dueling waters.
Afternoon. Thank you for joining us today in the Blue Room. My name's Gregory Milken, partner at March Capital Partners, and I'm going to lead a discussion here on entertainment, sports, and esports. We have some distinguished guests up here representing the Immortals organization, one of the leading esports organizations, which is a March portfolio company. So I'm just going to generally start off and ask them to give just a quick introduction of who they are and where they sit, and a little overview of how they got involved in esports or Immortals and why. And I think we'll start with Noah, who's founder of Immortals.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I guess my introduction is almost 4 years ago, I dropped out of college to start an esports organization, and that sounds a lot less crazy today than it did 4 years ago. And what initially started really just as a hobby project with some investors who were personally interested in the space ended up becoming something a lot bigger as the space continued to grow and get more and more outside interest. And so we've been really fortunate to kind of grow our own company and our own team alongside the growth that we've seen in the space. It involves some really great partners that you're going to hear from in just a little bit. And at this point, we sit in a position where we're at the forefront of kind of the mainstreamification of esports, right? Understanding the way to take something from this niche hobby product into something both that everybody can enjoy, but also something that commercializes and monetizes and engages in ways that are a lot more familiar to those of you familiar with the traditional sports world.
My introduction will be shorter. I'm Peter Levin. I head up games, ventures, and digital strategy at Lionsgate, as well as serve as managing director of Griffin Gaming Partners, which is an investment vehicle discreetly focused on the games industry. My involvement in esports and competitive gaming goes a long ways back to GameSpy Industries, which was actually the first investment I had ever made, and they were dabbling with competitive gaming back then in 99, 2000, kind of pre the commoditization of bandwidth. So we knew the more streams we served, the more money we'd lose, and we served a lot of streams, and we realized this was going to be a thing. And the first markets to commoditize the bandwidth were probably going to be the hotspots, and Korea ended up being very much one of them. An early investor in Immortals, the primary driver of that, because we had looks at all kinds of esports opportunities. The primary driver was the man on my right, Noah Whinston. His vision and perspective and grounded orientation towards esports was exactly the messaging and the narrative that we'd not yet heard from some of the opportunities that we were looking at, or at least didn't map onto our own strategy. So with Noah at the helm, and now Ari Siegel, our CEO, who's not here with us, I'd argue we have one of, if not the best executive team in charge of our operation. And lastly, it's the quality of the portfolio of investors. So Gregory and Team Milken have been involved from early on, and the man to my left and the organization he represents, I won't steal your thunder on your introduction, but just a huge differentiator for our franchise, and I think for the industry at large. The more companies like AEG that jump into the deep end of the pool, the more validated the entire space becomes.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to bring the lightning. So I'm George Pappas. I'm with AEG. A lot of people don't know what AEG stands for. It's Anschutz Entertainment Group, and we're owned by Mr. Anschutz out of Denver. But a lot of our subsidiary properties you're probably familiar with. So we are a global sports and entertainment company playing in 4 main buckets, whether it's our venues from Staples Center, LA Live, T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. We own the O2 out in London. We have holdings in Berlin and Shanghai from an arena standpoint with Mercedes-Benz Arena. We've got a rather compelling traditional sports ecosystem. We own the LA Galaxy, the MLS, and the Major League Soccer. We've got a third ownership in the Lakers. We own the LA Kings. You look into our music portfolio, and it's a hybrid of music clubs, theaters, festivals, as well as touring. So we own Coachella. Stagecoach will produce New Orleans Jazz Fest. So we've got a rather deep bench of assets. So we were a founding member of the MLS. So when Major League Soccer came out 10 years ago, we put some money into it, and people thought we were literally crazy to put money into a soccer league. And they were right, because we lost a fortune to start. However, our CEO or our owner has a long time horizon, and we were patient with that investment, and now franchises in the MLS are going for $250 million. So that was almost a proof point to start that says, hey, we can be patient, we can get into something for the long term. Second of all, our facilities group is partnered up at one point with ESL. So we were staging these large-scale global esports competitions in our venues. So we were noticing this new audience that we had never reached out to. Elusive, attractive, young, captive, and it was like, why are we not playing in this space? And if you start looking at what we did with the Galaxy, you start looking at Coachella and the audience space that sells out these festival grounds, it just made a ton of sense when we were introduced to Peter, Noah, and I was about to say Michael, sorry, Gregory, and Gregory. And we were honored to be part of this elite group of investors that can really help blaze this new trail. The one thing for us, because we play in traditional sports, we want to win. And being under the leadership of Noah and Ari and watching our team succeed and win, it just further validates the proof point that we're doing the right things. So we're happy to be on board, and we work very, very integratedly in terms of sales opportunities. So I work on our sponsorship sales group, and that being said, we're always trying to find ways to package in Immortals with Coachella or the O2 or Staples Center, or sell it standalone if it's not an endemic, and really find brands that are looking to hand raisers into esports. So that's my long-winded answer.
You would know he's in sales.
Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that perspective, on coming from the traditional sports and why esports matters. Peter, maybe you could spend a minute more on why esports is important, coming from the entertainment perspective in this time.
Sure. We're proud of the fact that we were the first studio to jump in and back an esports franchise, followed shortly by Disney and Comcast and Cox and several other internationally, including some of the larger media and sports organizations in China. But George touched on it, which is you're dealing with a consuming constituency that is extremely attractive. This is an audience that will, for the most part, never see a cable bill. They'll never see a satellite bill. And they're also extremely elusive. And so media companies and sports enterprises and anyone who has a vested interest in having deep connective tissue and an intimate relationship with that audience, they were fleeting in droves. And so for an entertainment company, such as a Lionsgate and the others, I think, that have jumped into the fray, it's a fantastic way to get far upstream. To understand the peculiarities of the consumption patterns of these demographics, and to learn from it, and then to, in our instances, to interoperate with the core business. So whether it's things like as simple as getting some of the athletes to film premieres and leveraging their social footprints to message around that, or even having the logo of one of the Stars television programs, on the jerseys, and having Reddit blow up about, hey, what is this Ash versus Evil Dead? And why is it on an LA Valiant jersey? That conversation alone and the amount of impressions and dialogue were phenomenally impactful for the intellectual property. So I honestly feel like in a relatively short amount of time, we paid ourselves back with respect to the investment, and also gleaned some tremendous insight, into what this audience was doing, and how we could better interoperate more efficiently with them.
So Noah, having been in this since 2015 with Immortals, the space is rapidly changing and has over the past couple of years. Maybe you could share just what you view as like the highlights, in terms of what esports has been able to accomplish in the past 3 or 4 years that have changed from what it was in 2015.
Yeah, so I think over time, the most important thing that has changed about esports is also something that hasn't really changed, right? Which is the generational divide in the consumption of esports and in kind of digitally streamed media, right? And so, plenty of 50-year-olds or older people that I talk to will say, like, why would you watch other people play video games when you can just watch video games? And that's a little difficult to explain, right? But can generally be summarized as, why would you watch someone else play baseball when you can just play baseball? Which everyone seems to find pretty normal. And so what I've noticed in esports, what got me to come into it in 2015 and the trend I've noticed continuing is that there is just this generational divide, right? Every single day, probably 2 or 3 esports fans get born, right? And these people, when they are growing up, they're playing games as kind of digitally first and digitally native consumers. They're going from playing games to watching other people play games on platforms like Twitch and Caffeine. They're going from watching people play games to watching people play games competitively in these professionalized esports contexts. And so our theory is gradually over time that becomes mainstream because as those consumers get older, they don't stop engaging with that type of content. So my goal isn't necessarily to take people that are 50 plus years old and turn them into esports fans. My goal is to capture that entire new generation of fans, and as they get older, they stay fans, and eventually, every demographic is an esports or a gaming fan. And I thought it was really interesting, just as kind of a funny anecdote. For a really long time, Netflix has said that they consider their biggest competitor to be sleep. And actually, on their most recent earnings call, I think they now are saying their 2 biggest competitors are sleep and Fortnite. And so it's been really interesting to see the way that gaming has become more and more just a primary form of entertainment. Right now, I think 95% of people under the age of 30 globally are gamers, and they actively play games as a primary or secondary form of entertainment. And so esports is just a derivative of that, right? People are participating in gaming because they enjoy the competition, they enjoy the challenge, and they also enjoy watching the people that are the best at those games in the world compete. And so I think that generational inevitability, that generational momentum has really been the thing that over the 4 years we're seeing continue to play out.
And the adoption is just so quick, right? I mean, go stand in line at a Starbucks, look at the person in front of you, they've got their mobile device. If they're not checking email, chances are you'll see somebody playing some sort of a game. So it's wild to see that it's literally right in front of you all the time. And we say something in a lot of our pitches, right? And we talk about this one-to-one relationship. You might watch somebody play an Overwatch League match, and that night when you go home to play, you're leveraging that skill set you learned during the Twitch stream. And we say this in the sense where, the Super Bowl was about a month ago, right? How many people here watched the Super Bowl? How many people put on pads right after that game and went and played that night? Right? Nobody, right? So that's kind of what's the cultural trend here is people are doing it immediately after watching it and consuming it. So it's rather powerful.
And I would just add on to that. I mean, 80% of global spending on all mobile app platforms is spent on games. 1/3 of the world's population plays games for an hour a day. I mean, these are just incredible statistics that are all going in the right direction, for us at least.
And George and Peter both bring up something interesting, which is mobile, right? 10 years ago, gaming wasn't nearly as big as it is now, and that's not just because of generational momentum, that's not just because of how mainstream it wasn't 10 years ago, but also because of the different platforms that those games are accessible on, right? When you have to buy a $5,000 gaming PC in order to be a gamer, a little tough to kind of make that case to your parents or your roommate or your significant other or anybody else. Mm-hmm. When you are able to access that gaming on the same device that you're using every day for work and for socializing, and frequently on a lot of the same platforms, that's when it gets really interesting. And in the places where we've seen the most widespread adoption, particularly in China and Southeast Asia, games aren't just becoming standalone things on a mobile device. Games are becoming primary social media apps. They're frequently becoming primary dating apps. They're becoming primary messaging apps. And so they're integrated from this functionality perspective into something that's a lot bigger than just kind of the core gameplay, and instead just becoming this medium of communication and social networking across multiple different functionalities and across multiple different demographics.
And it's also the demographics that are changing. 10 years ago, it was a primarily 85% plus male-driven audience. At this point, it's closer to 50-50. Mobile's a big driver of it. And you talk about the democratization that's going to happen on the consumption end with cloud gaming and 5G, right? With all the new big actors that are jumping into the theater with respect to cloud gaming and 5G, that's going to lead to wins both on the publisher side and on the consumer side, which is going to create less friction between the two. Publishers are going to have an easier time reaching audiences that before needed a $5,000 rig. At this point with the cloud computation, you can play on anything. You can play on any laptop, a tablet, and even a smartphone. Mm-hmm. So that democratization, is going to be more disruptive to the games industry, and inure to the benefit, again, of the audience and of the publishers and everyone in between than Netflix and Amazon have been to the film and television industries.
So I want to, hone in on two things, I think in the industry. One, there's been widespread success in esports in terms of number of people watching online. But if you look at what Riot's doing and what Blizzard's doing, the in-location competition is important too. So how important is this in-location venue, competition, regular season leading up to playoffs and world championships to the future of esports when you can have millions of people watching online? So how necessary is it to keep this physical in-location, in-person component?
Yeah, I mean, I think that experiential thing is super important, and I'll be brief and then defer to George on this, because I think, one of the pioneers of really being able to create super innovative and unique in-location experiences have been AEG, right? Like, you can listen to music by yourself online on Spotify, but the experience of Coachella and Stagecoach go way beyond that, right? And so in the same way, we like having this kind of duality where content is available online and anybody can access it and it's super democratic, but there's this kind of more unique communal experiential feeling when you're coming together in person.
No, I think that's the home run, right, is bringing people in venue to experience this. And people who haven't been in venue to experience it, I went to the Overwatch League Finals in Barclays Center back in July, which AEG manages, but it was an incredible experience to see 20,000 people, per day over 2 days going and rooting on, the London Spitfire and the Philadelphia Fusion. And it was a wild experience. And it's very different, the audience that comes to an esports event or the Overwatch League Finals event than we see at a Kings game or a Raiders game or anything else that we manage. And it was, per caps aren't the best because they don't get out of their seats to go buy beer, but at the end of the day, they're in there, they're participating, they're communicating through their social platforms and sharing the content that's taking place inside. But to that point, with Immortals and LA Valiant, we created something called a Cali Cup, right? And I don't have to tell anybody here in this audience if I say, LA Dodgers versus San Francisco Giants, you're going to get a visceral reaction, right? For some reason, NorCal and SoCal don't like each other when it comes to sports, right? So that being said, when we created this platform called the Cali Cup, and it was the LA Valiant versus the San Francisco Shock, we were able to create an experience that drove people to go root for the local team. And the big thing for us is because we're playing in Overwatch and all the matches are taking place up at Blizzard Arena in Burbank, we need to create a fan base. So when the Valiant plays in our home arena at LA Live next year, what is the grassroots effort to go to reach out to fans? So we are now doing a lot of inclusivity, right, being transparent, and these are all back to the values that Noah set several years ago when he started the business, right? Reaching out to underserved communities like girls in gaming, like LGBTQ, doing things with families, right? Because kids are playing, how do you bring the parent in? No different than maybe all of us went to a game when we were kids with our mom or dad, same type of a thing. Kids are now bringing their parents into these experiences, and it's becoming a much more well-rounded experience.
So I want to hit on two more things in the short time we have. One, historically, I think publishers have treated games and esports as marketing for the game itself. Have you all seen a fundamental shift in how publishers view that? Do you view them still as a little bit adversarial or as partners going forward in the next few years?
Well, I think from my side, certainly partners, and I think the publisher that's been most aggressive about treating esports not just as a marketing platform, but a core piece of their business has been Activision Blizzard with Overwatch League, right? They approached this in a very kind of professional, operational-minded way. They in-housed a lot of outside experience from the traditional sports and media worlds, and as a result of that, they were able to kind of take this esports property, which maybe 5 years ago would have just been something for the hardcore fan, something very, niche, and make it translatable and understandable, not just for a more mainstream audience, but also for more mainstream brands, right? They've assembled an amazing roster of sponsors and commercial partners around the league, including most recently Coca-Cola and State Farm, in a way that has turned this thing from a marketing effort into like a real revenue and profit driving business, the same as you would expect to see out of the NBA, the NFL, the MLS, or the NHL. And we're starting to see a lot of other publishers follow suit, right? That's been a really good example to prove that it can be done. And I think more and more game publishers are starting to realize that not only is esports a great retention tool, but there's also a lot of upside that you can capture if you can build a really sticky audience around it.
Yeah, and I would add, the way they have done it, they set the bar very high. But there's going to be a variety of different permutations for games that have different sized audiences and publishers that don't have the budget that Activision Blizzard was able to bring to bear. But they were able to, again, take away data points from, oh, we could build a better mousetrap. We shouldn't treat it as just an extension of promotion and marketing. Our fans and our audiences deserve better. They want better. They've now seen better. So I think you've seen leveling up on the production side of the end user product, the experience in venue with partners like AEG and others. And so once the fans get accustomed to that, and I liken it to, look, you can find Premier League and Formula One and the NFL, on multiple broadcasters, and you can also find professional cornhole. And so, kind of everything in between. Similarly, within the hierarchy within the game space, there'll be permutations of competitive gaming for the smaller, more niche titles that scale all the way up to the Overwatches.
So I'm going to try to leave time for a question or two, but I want to ask one last quick question. If there's one thing that you could make happen for the esports industry in the next 12 months to improve the industry overall, what would you want it to be?
I think from my side, one of the things that's going to be really important long term is kind of more unionization, both on the team end and the player end, right? I think the ability to do kind of long-term focused collective bargaining agreements is going to be really powerful towards putting everyone on the same path, right? Putting all these different stakeholders on the same path towards what a long-term mutually beneficial future looks like. So hopefully that happens.
Okay.
Well, on my end, I'm on the sales side, right? So we speak to a lot of agencies, a lot of brands, and you deal with test and learn budgets, and test and learn budgets are a little small, right? So we want people to jump in more with a longer tail to do more with us. So that'd be where I'm at. Like this past weekend, we were together. We did an esports immersion for an agency that came out from New York, and 40 of them sat down in a room just like this, and we went through all the pillars of what's happening in esports. And we said at the meeting, who here has been to an immersion recently for Major League Baseball or the NFL or the NHL or Major League Soccer? Nobody. That ship has sailed. So this is what's next. This is what's coming. This is the tip of the iceberg. So, you have a few blue chip brands buying in, but the whole thing, and we haven't said the word authenticity yet, but, how do you connect with this fan base in an authentic way so they don't turn you off? And that's, I think, the expertise of the folks at this panel to be able to, help guide that conversation for a brand so they're speaking to that audience in the right way so they don't just tune them out.
And I would add to it, I'd like to see some more mature and engaged distribution partners and prospects. I think there's Twitch and there's obviously YouTube. Caffeine as an up-and-comer, backed by some great folks and some very authentic DNA there. And again, on the cloud gaming front, you're going to see Google and Verizon and Sprint, and eventually you're going to see, Amazon's already announced that they're going to be in the mix. You'll have Netflix in there, Apple, Sony. So I think the more distribution partners that have differentiated products, that have different levels of appeal, that's also going to drive the economics of the entire industry.
I think we have time for one or two questions. Yeah.
There's obviously a state-by-state legalization of sports betting. How do you see that impacting esports and the ability to put a bet on esports and the like?
Okay, so the question is, how do we see legalization of sports betting impacting esports?
Yeah, so it'll be massive. First, keep in mind that esports is right now international, right? So there's a massive amount of betting already happening on esports outside of the United States. And actually, one of our brands that focuses a little more on Brazil has Betway, a traditional European sports book, as its biggest partnership. And so I think as it gets more widespread in the United States, you're just going to see a lot more engagement, right? I'm a big believer that having the ability to bet not only increases betting-focused engagement, but just general engagement around a sport, right? I think it makes it a lot more exciting. And so really looking forward to kind of be able to capture that higher level of engagement, but also kind of that higher level of per-fan monetization that happens when you can bet on the games.
Other questions? Yes.
So I think one portion that you didn't talk about is the traditional sports mediums, but like the NBA, they have their whole esports league. I'd be interested, you're talking about Overwatch and different things, I'd be interested where you think that blend goes there with esports.
Okay.
How do you think that continues? How do you think you connect there?
So the question is about traditional sports and their video game components like NBA 2K and the leagues they're running in comparison to something like Overwatch.
You have strong opinions about this.
I mean, I think it's fantastic, right? So I think as long as they're not, and the NBA is doing a great job of it, and I think MLS is doing a great job in terms of their lens for it, of treating it with, again, I'll use the word authenticity, right? And that's key. I think at the beginning, a lot of them saw this as yet, another marketing and promotion exercise, like you'd have the Madden NFL kind of gimmick leading up to the Super Bowl, but it was never very serious. And this is no joke with NBA 2K. They're doing a fantastic job with it. And Noah and I were at a panel that your dad put together last year with a bunch of owners of different types of sports teams from different leagues. And the NBA was clearly one of the more forward-thinking. But I think the thing that resonated most with those in attendance was the fact that when you start talking about the hundreds of millions of hours that are being consumed and engaged, whether it's Overwatch, League, Fortnite, now Apex, you know what they're not doing when they're doing that? They're not watching MLB games. And they're not watching films and television shows because there's only X amount of hours in the day. So I think the properties like the NBA and FIFA and MLS are doing a fantastic job of recognizing that and figuring out how to wrap their arms around it.
We're about a minute over, so I think we're going to have to end. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Gregory.